It's an absolute joy for me to present to you this evening Dr. Raisa Kumaga. Dr. Raisa is a counseling psychologist and mental health anti-racist, anti-racism activist. Her passionate drive and dedication is advocating for mental health within her community and wider, and to explore the frontiers of decolonizing psychology, delving into the complexities of dismantling colonial influences and tackling head-on the deep-seated impact of racism on mental well-being and the pursuit of social justice. And what we need more than ever is kind of energy and insightfulness, and that ability to articulate so clearly as you're going to hear some of the challenges ahead. And at this point, it's an absolute joy for me to introduce to you Dr. Raisa Kumaga.
Thank you, Harry. And thank you all for joining today, especially if you're in London or in the UK. The sun is shining. So I think the first time in a very long time. So I really am appreciative that you are all here. So I'm just gonna share my screen and also check if all my sound uh, and things are switched on. Um, yes, they are. Okay. Can I just double check if you can see this? Okay, lovely. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ripple effects of oppression and suffering among second generation Black African individuals whose parents were forced to migrate to the UK during the 90s. And this specifically comes out of my own context, which is related to my identity, but also related to my own parents' migration and the doctorate work that I did specifically with Somali individuals, which I'm currently working on a paper about that is almost there to get to submission. But this talk today is kind of bringing together some of the potential shared understandings within the Black African communities as a whole. And yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about these nuances in a bit. So just to kind of position and center this talk around my own position and who I am. So, like Harry already said, my name is Raisa, but I also have a Ghanaian day name, which is Akosia, which is the day on which the creator descended to create the universe. And I thought it was important to highlight this because some of the reflections in this talk is about the oneness of God and the importance of the Black lived experience. And yeah, spirituality and other kind of values are very important in Black Africans like myself. My identity is also part of being a second generation Ghanaian from the Netherlands, born and raised, and being aware of the fact that my parents had their own migration story to the Netherlands, which brings me to another point that I'll probably will be repeating, perhaps, that even though I'm looking at the Black African experience, I'm also aware that the Black African experience is heterogeneous because for my parents' migration story, their forced migration might not look like people who had to leave their countries that had to endure human rights abuses, conflict, etc. Um, However, like I said in this talk, I hope that at the end of this, there will be a great understanding of the psychological well-being of second generation um, Black Africans whose parents were forced to migrate, because there might be a shared understanding here within the Black African communities. And we also know that in general, there's a lack of clarity in the literature around the specific second generation experience. And also alongside that, the lack of clarity and expression of some of these social structures like colonism and racism on the individual and the groups. And this talk is centering the Black lived experience. And in that way, we are decolonizing psychology because we're looking at the meaning and how people are making sense of their experience within the context of what has happened to them. Which in this research as well, I've tried to conceptualize through a philosophical framework called Africana Feminology, but I'll get through all of this information today, hopefully. So like I said, the Black African community is heterogeneous. It has various subgroups. And often when we think about the continent of Africa, there are certain assumptions when thinking about displacement and migration. There might be certain assumptions about the reasons why people might migrate, or that the migration is only centered towards Europe, which again demonstrates that kind of colonial mindset that Europe and whiteness is the norm. But actually, we know that immigration has various different routes, and that actually most of the time people don't just go to Europe, but they go to other countries within the African continent. But we also are aware that Britain has a long history of preoccupation and relationship with the continent of Africa, whether it's through the Commonwealth or the preoccupation in taking resources from the continent and people through the transatlantic slave trade. The consequences, obviously, is that for a very long time, there's been occupation by European powers, and some of the intergenerational elements in my talk kind of talks to that kind of colonial experience. We're also aware that that's not the only narrative that Black Africans have in Europe and in Britain. We know that even before the transatlantic slave trade and colonism, there was a long history of Black Africans in the UK. I'm particularly interested in the migration routes from the mid-1990s because studies have found that the largest increase was during that time. Again, there were various conflicts, human rights abuses going on at that time. But again, that doesn't mean that that was the only reason that why people left. Some people left because of academic reasons, and then actually went back to sub-Saharan Africa to work. So it is important to also be aware that, yeah, there are various experiences and various people in this kind of group that have different language differences that will lead to a different experience, or they've maybe settled in other parts of the UK rather than London that will make perhaps a difference. So when we think about the forced migration experience of the Black Africans, I'd like to think about it in the sense of the partition of the global south and the continuous hostile environment in the global north. So Britain has a colonial legacy of the continent of Africa, which is represented in the carving up by African states by Western powers. And when we think about the second generation as well, we know that parents came to the UK and had to endure the hostile environment with its hostile policies and restrictions, and also having to kind of deal with who is deemed to enter Britain and who is allowed to enter Britain, and the different narratives around that. The Immigration Act, obviously, or the border practices in Britain colonial history are quite embedded, and we can see in the hostile environment that some people are allowed entry and have more and are granted more compassion. And this is part of that kind of explicit racialization. And as a result, this hostile environment means that Black Africans who are forced to migrate have to endure the marginalization, uncertainty regarding their status, punitive policies, and resulting socioeconomic disadvantage. Another kind of view that comes to mind in terms of the hostile environment is the premise around acculturation processes and forced migrants coming into the UK, and the interest in how they're acculturating, discussions about integration. However, we also know that these kind of processes have assumptions because they assume that it's only the forced migrants and their family that are going through this acculturation process, and also it often excludes the racialized experience. I think one kind of concept that really speaks to that racialized experience is the importance of the post-colonial. And Paul Gilroy has talked about this through his concept of the post-colonial melancholia, whereby the legacies of colonialism continue to shape contemporary societies and individual identities, particularly those of African descent living in the diaspora. And what that basically means is that there's a state of mourning or sadness that persists long after the formal end of colonial rule. And it kind of shapes culture, identity, and it influences how people perceive themselves and their place in the world. And he kind of suggests that post-colonial societies are often caught in a paradoxical relationship with their colonial past, but there's also a sense of nostalgia for a lost sense of identity and belonging, while also being resentful of the injustices and traumas inflicted by colonism. And this kind of emotional state manifests in different ways. And through some of my reflections with the Black African forced migration families, some of these kind of, I guess, glimpses of post-colonial melancholia comes out. So this kind of speaks to the concept of intergenerational trauma, which even when we think about intergenerational trauma can be quite a contested word because there's so much that we can think about when we think about traumas. I think it's important to position ourselves as kind of understanding it through the legacy of colonial violence, which violates both the physical and affective aspects of the Black African second generation's lives and their parents, and that actually investigating their lived experience is how that we can understand some of their trauma, and the oppression and suffering of colonialism is revealed and the lasting impact of that. So I'm gonna share a poem that talks about this element of colonial residue and the continuity of the hostile environment through a poem from, I think she is actually second generation, Somali individual, called Home. Is that working?
And the boy you went to school with who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin.
And the sound is also working?
Of a shark.
Yep. All good.
You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbors running faster than you, breath bloody in their throats. And the boy you went to school with who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factories, holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. No one leaves home unless home chases you. Fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. And even then, you carry the anthem under your breath, only tearing up your passport in airport toilets, sobbing as each mouthful of paper made it clear that you would not be going back. You have to understand And no one would put their children in a boat unless the sea is safer than the land. No one burns their palms under trains, beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the gallbladder of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled mean something more than journey. No one crawls under fences, wants to be beaten, wants to be pitied. No one chooses refugee camps or strip searches where your body is left aching, or prison because prison is safer than a city of fire, and one prison guard in the night is safer than 14 men who look like your father. No one could take it, could stomach it. No one's skin would be tough enough. The go home blacks, refugees, dirty immigrants, asylum seekers, sucking our country dry, niggers with their hands out. They smell strange, savage, messed up their own country, and now they want to mess up ours. How do the words, the dirty looks, roll off your back? And maybe it's because the blow is softer than a limb torn off, or the words are more tender than 14 men between your legs, or the insults are easier to swallow than rubble, than bone, than your child's body in pieces. I want to go home. But home is the mouth of a shark. Home is the barrel of a gun. And no one would leave home unless home chased you to the shore, unless home told you to quicken your legs. Leave your clothes behind. Crawl through the desert. Wade through the oceans. Drown. Save. Be hungry. Beg. Forget pride. Your survival is more important. No one leaves home unless home is a sweaty voice in your ear saying, leave. Run away from me now. I don't know what I've become, but I know that anywhere is safer than here.
Home is an 8.
So I just want to take silence after listening to this, because obviously we are aware this forced migration is something that is a quite topical experience that people are still going through, and these kind of experiences that Warshan has pointedly kind of shared is still happening today. And also being aware that this is something that continues throughout this generation, of pain and suffering from these experiences. So I just want to take time to kind of sit with that, and then I'll share my screen again. So when we think about the forced migration experience, we can see that this has an impact on the parents, and their families, and the specific individual. We have different studies that have shown time and time again that there could be prevalence of depression and further kind of difficulties on the individual. But at the same time, we also know that forced migration experience also leads to growth and resilience, and these kind of things are also passed down and shared with the second generation, and also something that often gets forgotten when we think about forced migration within the Black African communities, that actually there is growth that comes out of the pre-migration, during the migration, and post-migration. Some of the studies have also looked at post-migration processes, specifically on the individual and the family, looking at some of the processes of acculturation, how they adapt to the country that they resettle in, overcoming language barriers, the impacts on family separation, hostility, poverty, racism, which can all impact the parental kind of difficulties, but also the family as a whole. And then some newer studies have been looking at the effect on the family dynamics, the parenting, which can lead to children. Which brings me to the concept of intergenerational trauma, which is a concept that they try to conceptualize the transmission of traumatic suffering across generation. Historically, it's been looked at various type of kind of communities, but more and more they are noticing the effect of oppression and suffering within the forced migration population. There have also been research and theories around intergenerational trauma from kind of the transatlantic slave perspective, looking at the African American population. And yeah, even though the African American population is a different experience than perhaps the British Black African communities, there are some shared historical connection through this systemic oppression. And yeah, we can hold space for that kind of shared potential understanding, but also recognizing the specific experiences and perceptions that needs to be illuminated in the UK as well. The main premise of this kind of concept is that the trauma is viewed on a collective level. So there have been theories around what the definition is of intergenerational trauma. People conceptualize it as something that is passed on to children of the next generation, so the offspring. There's an element and focus on the historical trauma and the cultural memory of people and how that is passed down, and an imprint on communities. And it can also be conceptualized as something that happens within the person, so interpersonal, but also societal, and that therefore there are certain responses that are passed on to the next generation, which impacts their health and well-being. Because we're looking at the Black African forced migration group, again, they would have different meanings about what has specifically been passed on. And the kind of transmission of this trauma will potentially sit in different dimensions, between social dimensions, moral, political dimensions of that trauma, and potentially then exacerbates the stigmatization and systemic racism of this group. So what intergenerational trauma basically says is that there's a collective trauma that could increase the risk of PTSD or other difficulties within the next generation of forced migrants. But it is quite debatable whether this transmission takes place and means that it will result in mental health difficulties, or it would result in just kind of growth, or not necessarily something particular that would warrant necessarily mental health treatment. The systematic review, especially in this kind of forced migration studies, have often kind of focused on a specific group. And so there needs to be kind of more research within the communities within the continent of Africa to understand some of these transmissions. Some of the studies in this review as well, I think only 4 were related to, no, 4 actual studies were related to kind of the South Asian wars, the Eastern wars, and also the Rwandan war as well. But there is not enough studies in this field. However, generally speaking, they say that transmission of trauma can be through epigenetics, Unconscious Emotions and Collective Memory, which talks about how the forced migrant parents will potentially reenact their traumatic experiences, and that the child would kind of pick this up. And one study that has also been looked at in the British context is the Internal Oppression and Black Identity Wounds in Black Africans and Black Caribbeans by Dr. Eileen, who also talks about the kind of impact of the transatlantic slave trade and the colonial past, which then becomes unconsciously kind of processed as an internal kind of oppressor. And this kind of painful history is then constantly present and kept alive, which in her view is then creating an enmeshment and an over-attachment with this past. Because in the current day and age, it still gets kind of continually opened and compounded. And this then leads to this ongoing process of intergenerational trauma. Other kind of studies have looked at attachment representations, parenting styles, and communication styles, whether the forced migrants talks about what has happened to them or not, and the impact of having certain family scripts that we hold on or act from, which then start to kind of impact our values and belief system and how we then determine our life choices. And then there's potentially also another avenue for transmission of trauma through emotion regulation and embodiment, which when we think about emotion regulation, it's obviously kind of modulated by the process of emotions that is conscious and unconsciously. When we think about emotion regulation, it's also associated with autonomic nervous system and our physiology, which perhaps could also explain some of the somatic kind of experience of distress. And in some of my work, what came out is the felt kind of experience of that within the family, and the offspring potentially sharing emotions, and making sense of that emotional regulation of their parents. And that's why it's quite an embodied experience that is potentially intersubjective. It happens within that relationship. And so that kind of embodied experience is something that they also then interact it with in their own environment and experience of that continuous oppression and suffering in their day-to-day lives. So it becomes kind of a mark or imprint that then shapes norms and how people respond because of that colonial violence. And I think that colonial violence, because that leaves an imprint, it is quite imperative for how the second generation make meaning and make sense of their identity, who they are as people, and how they navigate their own current experiences in systemic racism. Because we can't separate necessarily the history and the past from the Black lived experience, because it impacts them. It's a continuity in time rather than a static experience. Oh, I don't know if I have time for another kind of video kind of thing, so I'm gonna skip this. But it's a very interesting video about some of the transmissions that I've already spoken about, and from the Gry Leary. And I think one thing that comes out from her video is the kind of specific responses that comes up when in the African American experience, they notice within the offspring and the parents. Which brings me to perhaps the gap or something that is noticeable within intergenerational trauma is that kind of assumption that's perhaps a one-way road. If you think about the forced migrant experience, there might be kind of like assumptions around the fact that they all going to be homogenous, but when actually we know it's not. That there's assumptions that they might be all damaged and therefore that's going to be transmitted, which we know is also not. And obviously we are aware that some of these diagnoses imply that there's a kind of clinical disturbance, which are also kind of based on Western values instead of kind of the values and experiences of the people of that continent. And it also kind of assumes that intergenerational trauma will be the same like the post-traumatic slave syndrome as the GRI has kind of conceptualized, where we know that actually we have a different kind of relationship with Britain and their kind of dominance on the continent. So that kind of also leads me with questions around, you know, how this transmission of trauma is passed on, and perhaps questioning whether the second generation is just passive in feeling all of these experiences and then reacting to that. And I would like to think that actually there's perhaps more going on. It's perhaps more reciprocal, more dynamic, maybe even much more embodied. And also to be aware of actually their own experience with the same kind of violent colonial legacy in their day-to-day experience through othering and other disadvantages that they experience in Britain. So in my kind of work, I've tried to focus therefore on the lived experience of the second generation through Africana phenomenology, which basically asserts that the philosophers like Viridou or J.K. had all imperative ideas about lived experience, but also people like Frantz Fanon, Tessonarau, Paul Gilroy. There's like so many people that have kind of developed their ideas based on the lived experience of Black Africans. And it also goes back to the importance of how we understand each other, and reclaiming stories that fits within this lens rather than the colonial history, and centering the meaning making of people's sense of self and how they relate to others in a more African-centric view on development. So it kind of gives more attention to the fact that history is continuous, and that in that continuous pace, development occurs. It focuses on the Black African experience in the world, highlighting the challenges, but also the triumphs, and bringing back what the impact is of this colonial violence and continuous systemic oppression. One thing that which such thinkers kind of focus on is that post-colonialism is based on the unequal and disadvantaged representations of racialized people, and that within Africana phenomenology, there's a commitment to explore these in the modern world now, and kind of fields like critical psychology also acknowledge that it's about the interrogation of the fluctuations of post-colonial and psychology, and resisting some of the kind of views around that in psychology, but also about some of the resistance in present society. So some of the kind of interrogations that I've try to do, and I've noticed that perhaps there's kind of a shared experience there with the Black African community, is this concept of intergenerational conflict. So in intergenerational conflict, there's the view that a parent who is not in the same generation of the young person and has also resettled in a country, that there'll be certain challenges, and normally they kind of view this as something that is based on kind of culture, that because there's a different kind of cultural views between the parents, that means there's going to be some challenges. What I found and what I've started to reflect on is that perhaps the second generation may be responding to their parents' vulnerability and survival in kind of the systemic oppression and in the suffering that they have endured, whether it's within the hostile environment, within kind of present day experiences. And as a result, some young people and young adults then experience heightened responsibility and perhaps anxiety about their family's welfare and about the future of their family. This also will tie in with other concepts like adultification, where there's the society that views Black Africans as kind of more as adults. And what kind of I notice is that kind of interaction of actually the society positioning them into adults, and the young person or adult having to endure and notice the kind of suffering that leads to trying to survive and take care of their parents. So it's kind of like a reciprocal dynamic experience. But this is quite nuanced because in certain communities, there are values that are similar to holding the community together, and related to kind of making sure that the family is in kind of good positions. And in a way, some kind of researchers on the continent, for example, have explained that responsibility could be tied into that kind of parenting attitude that they have. I think what I argue is that perhaps it's on a kind of continuum, that for some young people and young adults, that kind of responsibility sits with their values, is kind of tolerable. But actually, when the societal influences of racism and systemic racism comes in play, plus the survival that their parents are in, would mean that the pressures and the anxieties increase. And so I'm gonna leave it at that because of time. And then that leads me to thinking about the importance of systemic oppression and alienation within that experience of second generation, where we know that there's that in Britain and in the rest of the West, whiteness is seen as the kind of starting point, the norm, and that it means that the second generation Black Africans are navigating an environment where they're constantly being othered, because this oppressive relationship assumes and asserts ideas about them. And as a result, they will have adaptive responses to this constant threat and of rejection and discrimination, and perhaps would feel experiences of powerlessness, hopelessness, internalized shame, and threat to an existence because of the internalization of the hostile environment and the continuous systemic oppression. And Akbar, he noted that this is basically what happens, that they find themselves in this kind of experience where there's a domination and imposition of a fundamental European system of reality on Black people, which then leads to the denial of the African conception of self. And this is perhaps where that this distress within the family leaves this kind of intersubjective space between the parents and the offspring, because they can see that within each other and within themselves. So another kind of thing then that I'd noticed perhaps is a shared experience is this the experience of the external threat and an inner turmoil in the reciprocal relationship between the parents, the offspring, and the society. When we think about the offspring specifically, they have this kind of compassion to the vulnerability of their parents, but also kind of potential distress and responses, which risks that kind of heightened responsibility, but also guilt feelings. And what this perhaps also shows is that the responsibility and guilt is held within that system, so the parents and the offspring, when actually the reality is that the holding environment for the forced migrants is unsafe because of the hostile environment, because of the legacies of that colonial violence and current systemic oppression. So this concept of holding environment is something that I've used to make sense of intergenerational trauma within Black African forced migrants. And this holding environment is a concept that has been kind of extended from just parent and child to the society as a whole. And in a way brings back the responsibility to society and the damages in it, potentially because they are not providing a safe environment. And we know that in the relationship between parents and child, a holding environment allows for the expression of distress, understanding, and support. And so, extending it to the society means that Black African forced migrants will regain stability that transcends generation. But if the caregiver is more preoccupied with surviving and surviving this kind of hostile environment, surviving the systemic oppression, and there's not a holding environment for that family and for the forced migrants, that means that the second generation is then holding that for their parents, whilst also experiencing their own hostile intrusions. So that kind of creates a double-edged experience. So there is kind of I guess a scope or a gap with kind of reestablishing connections between communities, families, but also in changing policies so the holding environment can be more established for this group. I think this is so the caregiver, like I said, the caregiver's focus is then on survival, while the second generation is also navigating their parental but also their personal experience of hostility. And that actually intergenerational trauma also means that we can transition from survival to thriving and resistance by illuminating that as well in our understanding of the Black African experience. And the resistance is something that I've noticed perhaps is within that nostalgia, the reminiscing of kind of the memories, because nostalgia can also be viewed as a coping mechanism, a defense mechanisms when being confronted to that kind of lack of holding environment, and perhaps becomes then a resistance against the narrative ensued on the Black African body. The other kind of flip side of kind of nostalgia within the intergenerational trauma experience is that there might be certain gaps in stories that are shared, which potentially lead to gaps within the second generation's mind about their family, what has happened, the pre-war kind of experience. If the parents find it difficult to talk about it because it has too much pain around it. We know that people naturally understand themselves through others and within themselves. And when there are these gaps, our brain will try to make sense of this on their own. But at the same time, there's also opportunity for richness and significance of oneself if those stories are opened and are shared amongst each other. So the main takeaways are that if you think about intergenerational trauma, perhaps in a broader sense, more nuanced, it could be a political, is part of the political legitimacy, can be a way to shape narratives and also resistance to some of the policies in the hostile environment. And that actually it is perhaps a way to recognize and acknowledgement the impact of these structures and systems that are impacting not only the forced migrant, but also their children and the next generation. The stories of trauma can be constructed for different purposes. It allows for individuals to make sense of their suffering. It kind of also leads to rewriting and retelling the history that informs that identity. And that the story that works for one of these purposes may not have the same efficacy for the others. But holding in mind that when we think about the Black lived experience, it is about finding out what those efficacies are for one another. And intergenerational trauma shapes individual identities. It intertwines with a sense of self and belonging. But it also raises questions about heritage legacy as they are confronted with inherited trauma complexities. The kind of impact of this traumatic stress that parents experience can be also ways of sustaining one's culture or one's kind of value system, like nostalgia, despite oppression, and that can also be passed down. So that is it for the end.
Thank you, Dr. Raisa. I love the detail, the references, and the I use that word dense in a really positive way because there's so much in there. Are we good with sharing those slides, because we're up against the clock and we're not really going to get much time for any questions, but people might want to kind of go away, and if they've not come across epigenetics before or any of the kind of concepts, they might want to kind of just go and follow up. Is there anyone who's got a burning question or a comment that you'd like to make just before we close?
If I can go.
Go ahead.
Am I audible? Hello, Dr. Raisa. I'm Nikita. I'm joining from India, and I'm a PhD scholar. I'm working on the aspects of where families are affected by the trauma and death of the father, and the wife and the child go through that. And I also observed adultification in my work. But I also observed this silencing of the boy child, where the boy child, assumes so much of responsibility that we expect from an older boy child in the family. And that leads to such kind of silencing for that child that they never ask about the death, even though they know that the death has actually happened. And this, I'm talking about a 7-year-old child, and then they grow and the child becomes 15. And then also the mother also doesn't discuss this. So do you think that that also happens with the identification, that there is some kind of silencing and discomfort with sharing of the pain with the family members, and then it also affects the family?
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's a very interesting work that you're are carrying out, which definitely, again, shows some of the kind of shared experience, because the silencing definitely came up in when thinking specifically with the Somali population, where there's also kind of gender differences about like how boys are being perceived, how women are being perceived. And yeah, this kind of form of silencing has kind of a, I guess, legitimacy, because for the parents, it is that pain that comes up when they think about their pre-war, but even their kind of like post-migration experience of just being a forced migrant in the UK. But what some of the second generation spoke about is kind of like, yeah, sensing that and still noticing and having questions about that, but not having necessarily space for that either. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting kind of yeah, process that ensues. Which again, some people kind of say that this transmission is perhaps this unconscious memory, or this unconscious kind of experience, or this that attachment representation, or it's that way of communicating. I think it's more interesting to kind of understand like what is the meaning of that for that 15-year-old or for that second generation when this silencing happens. So yeah.
Yes, it is interesting. So when you say, it happens on a continuum, that it values are also aligned, but the additional pressure is also there, then it may also have a long-term impact on the life of the second generation person. The other aspect is, you began by saying something about spirituality. And since I'm working on death and its impact on the wife and the child, spirituality is actually very important in my work, given the context of the Indian culture, that we are deeply very religious. So, I mean, there are time constraints, and you didn't, you weren't able to discuss it, but it would have been very interesting to listen to that side of your story.
Yes. I'm definitely going to publish my work, especially for the Somali second generation, because that definitely brings up this like the religious side to it. But I think as a whole, if you think about the Black African community, we're kind of like centered in the spirituality. That's why I started with my name. Like my name in itself starts with God and the universe. So it's just part of, yeah, who we are, and transcends, yeah, a lot of the things yeah, we make sense of in the world. So yeah, it's a very important item.
Fabulous. Thank you. Any other quick questions before we close? Because I am usually quite a stickler for finishing bang on 7. But yeah, just
I think Sophie had a question about internalized racism that I could quickly attend to. I think that definitely comes up when we think about the kind of alienation and rejection, and therefore kind of almost disavowing your own sense of self. And yeah, definitely something to kind of talk about a bit more, but I was obviously not able to kind of share everything. But that, yeah, sense of internalized racism and people's own anti-Blackness towards themselves is definitely something that comes through. I guess in the aspect of the holding environment, I'm kind of aware that this internalized racism is another response to the fact of, yeah, all these kind of different spheres that the second generation needs to kind of has to kind of deal with.
fabulous. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Raisa, for, as it's been noted in the chat already, a very insightful presentation. Thank you all of you for joining. Please do make use of the Decolpsych website, www.decolpsych.com. Share with your colleagues, your friends, dip into it. We do this pretty much as a voluntary pro bono act. The kind of putting all of the speaker series costs money. We're not funded at the moment, so any donations are always welcome. We don't have a begging bowl, but just kind of bear that in mind, and anything you can do to support, please do. And finally, as I said at the start, we really want to make this dynamic. So if you've got thought pieces, spoken word pieces, any academic articles you want to submit to the website or get involved in any way, just reach out to us. I'm really keen to make this inclusive. Thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day, wherever it is in your day so far. Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.